the NCAA might not die, but it's going to be changed as we know it, and pretty drastically.
That was Mark Fairley today on the Running Effect podcast, and I'm your host, Dominic Schlueter. I'm thrilled you've clicked on this episode and are choosing to spend your time with me. Yes, the title might be a little glim, but it's the focus of today's conversation. And Coach Mark, is a man at the forefront of this discussion of roster limits and the effects of the new landscape of the NCAA. He actually recently wrote a letter to Congress in hopes of standing before a federal judge in April as an advocate for the removal of the NCAA's new proposed changes to roster limits. We dive deep into that in this conversation. And for a little bit of background on Coach Mark, he's Liberty University's assistant track coach and meet director. And prior to that time, he was a standout athlete at Central College, where he actually won a NCAA title D3 in the steeplechase in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Today's conversation, we brush over that and talk about his coaching career and individual career before that a little bit. But the center of this discussion is very much around roster limits, what they are, how they came about. A few months ago, I had a conversation with an awesome guy, an athlete by the name of Stone Smith, who competes for Ole Miss. He kind of gave the athlete perspective. Coach Mark gives the coaching perspective, and there's no better person to do it than the man who is really trying to advocate to Congress and at a high level to make this not go into effect. Really thoroughly was benefited and educated from this conversation. And I know you guys will be educated on the subject even more so after listening to this conversation, or maybe be introduced to it for the first time. My only note for you before letting you soak up the wisdom from Coach Mark is, if you enjoy the podcast, consider giving us a follow or subscribing to the podcast if you're watching on YouTube. Also consider giving us a 5-star review. That is the easiest way in which you can help us out. It takes like 5 to 10 seconds to hit those 2 buttons and greatly helps us out. With all those notes aside, I hope you all enjoy this thoughtful conversation with the one and only Coach Mark Fairley. Coach Mark Fairley, welcome to the Running Effect podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Oh, I'm doing amazing. Super excited to chat with you, Dominic, and looking forward to what our conversation brings.
I think a lot of people, based on the title and show notes of this episode, will think that this conversation is structured around roster limits and that whole discussion. And we're going to dive deep into all of that soon. But I do want to give you your own flowers and give some context to how you're even in the position to be talking about roster limits and how it even affects you. I know you're a standout athlete back in the day, and that kind of paved the way for you to be a coach, but I'll let you fill out that story. So what's the brief Spark Notes version of Coach Mark and how he got into this role at Liberty today?
Yeah, well, like you said, I'm I'm excited to talk about the roster limits and things like that, and kind of how it got into this position. This is actually my 7th year here at Liberty, and I've served in a variety of different positions. And I actually, kind of working back, from Iowa originally, and went to a small Division III school in Iowa called Central College. Had a great career there. Loved just the college experience. Loved D3, and had an amazing coach, amazing teammates. But through that process, knew from my sophomore year of college that I wanted to be a college coach. And so as I was looking into different colleges to potentially be a GA at, I thought, what's the most opposite of the college that I've been to? So I went to a small liberal arts, kind of more secular environment school, and I searched like top Christian Division I programs in the nation, and Liberty was one of them. Without getting into the whole story, was hired in as a GA my senior year of college, and moved out to Virginia, basically knowing no one, right out of college. And from there, the coach at the time actually resigned a few weeks before the season. And so I got thrown into being an interim coach. And during that time, I was really super excited to coach, and just kind of like wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, and had no idea what to expect. But through that first semester of me actually coaching, and it was me and another coach, Rebecca Ricksecker, who's the James Madison coach now. It was just us two working with the distance runners. And through that experience, I was like, coaching's what I want to do. Like I thought that's what I wanted to do, but now that I've done it, this is what I want to do. And so after that semester, they hired a new coach full time, and I worked as a GA under him for a number of years, and then that turned into a volunteer coaching position, and we host a lot of meets at our facility. So I became the meet director for our 11 meets that we host at our facility, and then this year I kind of tacked on another role of facilities manager as well. And so just kind of making things work. But I currently, the past 3 years, we house a pretty big women's roster. We have 31 women on the team, and I kind of get to work with the B squad of that team. And there's 17 girls that are in the group that I work with. So I kind of am their go-to coach on a day-to-day basis. But me and Coach Heather Zealand and Coach Isaac Wendland, we all meet together for planning purposes, and we all have practice together. So just to give some of the girls some individual attention, because 32 girls is 32 girls is a lot of girls to pay attention to on a workout.
A unique part of that story while at Central College was you actually won the men's steeplechase national title in 2018 for D3 Outdoor Championships. You failed to mention that, if I'm not mistaken. So congrats on winning an NCAA title. Quite impressive. But the first thought that I go to is, why didn't you try to pursue running at a higher level? Because obviously, yes, it's D3, and I'm not going to be a fool and insist that it's the same thing as, winning a D1 title in Eugene. But, they're D3 runners. Like Alex Phillips is a former podcast guest who's illustrated this. You can take leaps and strides within the sport if you get in the right situation. So where was the passion for coaching, and why did that take precedence over personal athlete development?
Yeah, no, good question. And I think it's funny. I actually follow Matt Wilkinson on Strava. He's another former Division III national champion who obviously went to the Olympics this year. And I commented on his Strava post after he qualified for the Olympics, and I just said, just the typical progression for a Division III national champion. So he liked that comment. I'm not sure if he knows who I am, but he, as far as for me personally, the steeplechase was like awesome, and I was like, man, I love running. That was like the best way to end a collegiate career, is winning nationals. But actually, that same day I was scheduled to work at a summer camp. It's kind of a Christian summer camp up in northern Wisconsin. And I show up at camp, and they're like, hey, how was your school year, Mark? And I was like, oh, actually, I just won nationals in the steeplechase earlier today. And they're like, what's the steeplechase? And so pretty quickly, the high of winning a national title kind of vanished. And just kind of the impact that I knew that I would be able to have as a coach was bigger than the impact I would have as kind of pursuing an athletic dream. And for me personally, I've never been someone who's like, I just love running for the sake of running. I love it because of the community it brings. I love it for the relationships that I get to build. And so that's kind of when I came out to Liberty and to make that decision of whether to continue training. That was a big aspect of that.
You ready to dive into the weeds of roster limits?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first question, set up the stage for the listener. What are we referring to when we talk about roster limits, and how did this even nature come about?
Yeah. So, and disclaimer, I don't claim to be the expert on everything, house settlement, NCAA roster limits. However, I've kind of been invested in this whole search and maybe search and rescue a little bit to try and figure out what exactly it is and how to address it, and maybe how to make it change. Because everything I've heard, there's a lot of negatives and things like that. And so to jump into your question of what exactly is it, basically in this summer, different things were kind of surfacing about potential roster changes, and I kind of saw that and was like, oh, that's probably not going to happen. But as the year progressed, our athletic director, associate athletic director came and met with our coaches, and he explained it kind of the same way I'm about to explain it, and kind of gives a brief overview. So basically, from what I understand, a group of lawyers kind of approached some athletes, one being Grant House, who's a swimmer, and that's kind of what the settlement is named after. So they approached him and maybe a few other student athletes and said, hey, you guys were gypped out of money from losing money on name, image, and likeness between 2016 and 2020. We can sue the NCAA, who, by the way, the NCAA, I don't know if they've ever won a lawsuit, but they rarely win lawsuits, so they're kind of an easy target. And so we can sue the NCAA and make some money, and you guys can get what you deserve, which is money off your name, image, and likeness because of the time frame you've been. So they sue the NCAA. It becomes this big thing, and since the NCAA never wins, they kind of had to come to a settlement. And so this settlement kind of came into effect and it has three prongs. So the first prong of the settlement is they settled at $2.8 billion, which is just an insane amount of money. And so they're like, hey, we're going to lose this. Yeah, we're going to lose this. It's $2.8 billion. And that money is going to be distributed to athletes that competed in the NCAA Division I level from 2016 to 2020, maybe 2021. I'm not exactly sure. And so that money is being paid out by Division I institutions over the next 10 years and distributed to those student athletes over the next 10 years. And so out of that prong of the settlement, 75% of that $2.8 billion is going to football. Then 15% of that is going to men's basketball. 5% is going to women's basketball. And then the other 5% is going to all other sports in the NCAA. So that's prong number one. Prong number two is now institutions can have revenue sharing up to $20 million. And even some institutions are, I think, finding a way to get around that too, with maybe this Michigan football player, high school senior, getting paid $15 million to come be a player on Michigan's team. So we got that prong too, is now institutions can share the revenue of TV contracts, just different things that jersey sales, they can share that revenue with their student athletes and almost make them like employers of the university. And then the third part, which is kind of the part that brings us to this conversation, is the roster limits. And so from my best understanding, the NCAA is like, hey, we just got sued for restricting athletes the amount of money they can make. And right now we have set amount of scholarships that fully funded programs can give to their student athletes. So for track and cross country, it's 12.6 for men. It's, I think, 16 or 18 for women. And that's the set number of scholarships that you can get. And so based off of that, we have the NCAA is like, hey, we don't want to get sued for restricting money again. So in order for us to still have some legislation over each sport and be a governing body for intercollegiate athletics in the Division I level, we're going to put roster limits. And so from what it sounded like, they had some conversations with different committees and kind of did a deep dive into what those limits look like. And for track and cross country specifically, they landed on the number 17 cross country runners and 45 track athletes. So that's the maximum amount of roster spots that an academic institution at the Division I level can house. But as you know, I mean, I listened to that podcast where you interviewed Stone Smith and a runner for the SEC. They've already come out as a conference saying, hey, if this goes through, we're actually going to bump that down even lower to 10 roster spots for cross country and 35 for track. So that's kind of the big overview of what it looks like.
So well said, and I appreciate you stating it in the way in which you did. It was super easy to follow along, and I feel like I learned a lot just there. My first follow-up question for you, are the roster limits a way in which the NCAA will make back all the money that they lost? Like, what's the key? And I know you kind of mentioned this, but for my greater understanding, what's the key reasoning behind the roster limits?
Yeah, and as far as the money goes, I don't really think that the roster limits has much of a impact on the money situation because that money is getting paid. Part of it's getting paid by the NCAA, part of it's getting paid by NCAA institutions over the next 10 years. So for a school like Liberty, we're having to pay a certain amount of money each year for the next 10 years.
Okay, so just to clarify, how do roster limits connect to point 1 and 2, which is the $2.8 billion settlement and then the revenue sharing?
And I guess my interpretation is that that is a new way that the NCAA is going to govern the sport of track and field and cross country and every single uh, sport in the NCAA. So
Got it.
because
So it's
of
basically
the
like the settlement happened, the revenue sharing is now a thing. They're basically like, because of these two things and the new state of how things operate, we're going to shift roster sizes to properly function underneath these kind of two new realities, or no?
yeah, and
Okay.
that's what how I would interpret it, and I think that's the funny thing about it is like it does seem out of place in this settlement. It's just kind of like, oh, we'll tack that up there, and now, and that's like the question everyone's asking is like, why? And if that is happening, like all the administrations, schools are just trying to scramble to figure out what they're going to do.
What's the best explanation from the NCAA for why they're doing what they're doing? I'd imagine there's some, maybe it's confusing, but what's the best explanation you've heard from them?
So I think I haven't spoken to anyone specifically from the NCAA, and I think when it comes to roster limits, I can't really speak to anything that they're specifically doing. I think that they're trying to figure out, hey, we have this big lawsuit. We're trying not to go under. Um, let's put something together in order to make things work.
I'd assume at these boardrooms and within these meetings, people in their fancy suits, like on the board of whatever the NCAA or SEC, I I I see good nature in the world, so I feel confident in this statement. I don't think they're sitting around and saying, "How can we destroy the sport of cross country and track and field, or destroy NCAA sports as a whole?" Obviously, in
Hmm.
their mind, they actually have the opposite view, which is, how do we grow the sports plural? How do we grow the NCAA and its impact? What, as far as you could see, playing devil's advocate here, what's the best possible outcome that could come from this? And within your best heart, finding it within you, what is the good reasoning behind any of this, if any?
Yeah. Well, Uh, I think anytime there's an issue, you can either see it as a problem or an opportunity. And I think a lot of good coaches, good administrators are trying to see this as like, hey, this is a completely different scenario. Um, and so there is maybe some silver lining that you could find. I think in conversations with different coaches, if you have a smaller roster, you're able to invest even more deeply into those connections with those athletes. Um, and you're able to probably make a bigger impact on their lives. And I think you can either have a big impact on a small group of people or a small impact on a big group of people. And it's kind of playing that two different games and at different points of your life and in different circles, you're bouncing in and out of that sphere of influence. But I think that that's one silver lining that I can think of is like, once everything would go through, and you only have X amount of people on your team, then you're really able to fully pour into them. But I think as far as is there a solution, uh, if all this goes through, I think that eventually, with the direction that football's moving, they're going to have to do something to split away from some of the other sports, and and then maybe football is playing at this like almost professional level, but then maybe some of the other sports can play at maybe what the NCAA was originally uh, for more of like an amateur sports that kind of helps feed into that professional scene.
Is the issue at all money? And, we'll talk about the concerns and objections as you stated it within the document that you sent over to me. So that the issue that would happen if this were to go through, but is money a big issue? And is it that schools currently with the lawsuits and settlements and all that, is it that they no longer can fund the amount of spots they have, or is it completely unrelated to that? Because in my opinion, if you have the money, what like the only possible reason to do this, in my opinion, would be if you just don't have the money, and for the sake of these programs surviving, you have to do this.
Yeah, well, I think from a money standpoint, each program is each school is different, right? And so I can't speak to every institution and what they're doing, but I know that like from a SEC school standpoint, they're not having to cut the roster size down to 10 because they can't afford 17. It's more of a situation in where they're looking at the football, the money makers, the revenue generating sports, and trying to figure out, hey, how can we maximize this settlement for those athletes? And from, I guess at Liberty University, for example, like we have definitely been blessed with a lot. I showed your indoor track earlier. We have a 200-meter hydraulic banked track. We have so many resources for our student athletes, cutting edge facilities, weight room for just our team. But it's still, we're going to still have to take a little bit of a hit because now we're having to pay X amount of money over the next 10 years for this settlement. However, our university is doing everything it can to try and not only maintain compliance within the Title IX situation, but also with these new roster limitations as well. So I can't really speak to the financial status of each institution, but my gut is telling me that the schools that are benefiting from this most, it's not affecting their budget numbers, and that's why they're having to cut roster numbers.
Title IX, I think, is the elephant in the room within these conversations. Again, kind of going through our vocabulary here, can you describe what that is to a listener who's unfamiliar with it? And my simple question off of that is, do you think that Title IX should be revisited in the context of all of these new things and how they've affected and shaped the sport?
Yeah, so Title IX, again, I mean, especially in the sport of cross country and track, has always been kind of a topic of contention, and some teams have. So a place like Liberty, in our history, we've housed a bigger women's roster, and a smaller men's roster for cross country, and so kind of to keep with our three-pronged approach for the settlement, there's also kind of a three-pronged approach to what makes a school in compliance with Title IX. And so the first portion of Title IX is, and to kind of back up a little bit, Title IX is kind of a law that's it's in the Department of Education, and it is helping govern equality opportunities between men and women. And so that's at its core is they're trying to make equal opportunities for women and men in life, in school, and in our situation in sport, right? And so the three prong to Title IX is one, proportionality opportunities. And so each institution, they look at how much percentage of their student population is female, how much percentage of their population is male. So at a place like Liberty, we have roughly 45% of our whole student body is males, and half of or 55% of our student body is females. And so now our athletic department has to match those numbers and percentages within 1% for opportunities, roster spots for each sport. And so since our football team is a fully funded FBS football team, we have X number of roster spots. We have to make up for that with other sports. So that's why we house a big women's track and cross country program. That's why we have a men's or a women's field hockey team, a women's lacrosse team, a women's swim team, but we don't have the men version of that at the NCAA level. And so that's the number one prong in Title IX. Number two is financial aid scholarships. So that kind of goes back to what we're saying. If football has 88 scholarships, that means throughout all the other female and male sports, they have to be proportionally equal in scholarships. And then number three is they kind of call it the laundry list, but it's equitable opportunities. So the female and male athletes are able to use similar type facilities. They're able to use the athlete cafeteria. They're able to kind of have the same experience from a travel perspective. And so Liberty's done a fantastic job over the course of the last while since I've been here of being compliant in all three of those areas. And I think that's the big question is like, how can schools maintain this compliance in Title IX while also trying to manage roster limits? And it's definitely a dance to figure that out for athletic administration.
Obviously, the NCAA is a, some might not say well-oiled machine, but I'll say, for maybe lack of a better way of phrasing it, well-oiled, sophisticated machine, and it kind of has to be with the size of the NCAA as a whole. But when we talk through some of these things and these terms and everything that goes underneath them, I can't help but think, are we not making things way more complicated than they have to be on every level? What's your thought process on that and ways in which the NCAA could just simplify everything and not make things so complex for athletes and coaches?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question is how can we make this more simple and not more complicated? And I mean, at its root, for me as a coach, I wanna pour into young student athletes' lives and make a difference through the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with some COVID years. I want to make a difference in their life here. That's not just gonna get them an NCAA title or a conference championship or a regional berth, but is helping them become better fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, lawyers, doctors, teachers. And so at its root, like that's what we do as coaches. That's what we want to do. And I think either you find that as a coach or you get out of the profession pretty quick because ultimately it's a big time commitment and a big sacrifice of some other things that you could do in your life. But I think that's at its root. I think most coaches would say this is making our job more complicated, and it's even had me question like, hey, what division, what level do I want to coach? If my mission and vision for my life is to just make an impact in people's lives through the sport of coaching, I don't want to be at a Division I institution where I'm having to take away opportunities from people and not give them opportunities.
At what point so the roster limits thing, has that been voted on? Is that the law of the land? And if so, when does that go into effect?
So this is the unique thing, because everything I've read before kind of digging into this is like, hey, this is basically as good as done. July 1st is when everything happens. And sorry, but you have there's no grandfathering into this system. All these athletes are kind of left to kind of figure out for themselves what they're going to do. But basically the judge, I think back in September or October, had a preliminary hearing and kind of preliminarily approved it until April, I forget, 6th or 7th. And that is when they're going to have the final hearing. And it's this judge, Judge Wilkin. She's a federal judge in the state of California. And she is basically, from what I understand too, this is her last case. She's about to retire. And this is kind of her final, and it's going to be a pretty infamous case. Yeah. And so she's the one that is basically going to give the thumbs up or give the thumbs down on April 7th. And from what the conversations I've had with different people and lawyers investigating this and kind of looking into it from a legal side of things, is it's likely that she's not going to fully pass this right on April 7th. And what might happen more likely is she might say, hey, here's a thumbs up. We're going to have this pass, but change this, revisit this. And so some people have said, hey, it might not even happen until June, but with how slow things work, it could maybe not even happen until August or even later, or they might say, hey, we're going to come back to this in 2 years. But there's a lot of speculation, and it depends on who I've talked to. But up until April 7th, nothing is final and nothing is completely set in stone for this next year.
And just to be clear and clarify, the lawsuit and what that judge is hearing the case on is the $2.8 billion settlement, and that's what's affecting roster limits, correct?
Yeah, so the athletes and lawyers that sued the NCAA, they're basically like, yep, you get this money, and this money is distributed in this way, and it's affected roster limits and revenue sharing.
Got it. If this did get struck down, would the NCAA continue on the path of roster limits, or would that just automatically be nullified and things would stay as are if it gets shot down? I know it's hard to know, but
yeah, I think it's hard to know. Some people have said, well, the SEC and other conferences are already kind of moving forward and making the decisions from conference level too. So they're kind of like, if the NCAA doesn't do it, we're doing it, and if you want to play at our level, like, you have to do it too. And so there's that argument that's a potential of what could happen. However, there's also in my mind, it's like Title IX is also already kind of helping control roster sizes and roster limits. And so the NCAA doesn't really need to govern that because Title IX already is kind of governing that. And then it kind of still comes up to the institution of how they want to organize things in their athletic department.
Took me too long to get to this, but in the document you sent me, I think the most eye-opening number that we should talk about is that if this goes into effect, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, if this goes into effect, the projected elimination is over 3,000 plus roster spots across Power 5 schools. Again, Liberty is not a Power 5 school. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we're not even talking about immediate effect of you and your athletes. We're talking about just Power 5 schools. So it'd be even a larger number than that. When I think about that kind of number, it gets me emotional in the sense of, I know that's a number, but you break it down per individual and in the story, I've learned this on the podcast, the stories that it takes, the determination, the drive, the dreaming from when you were a kid. Like, sports is truly so special. And so many people have this D1 dream that's like, for 14 to 18-year-olds, it's like the equivalent to what the American dream was to someone 100 years ago coming off the boat to America. And to have that all squashed doesn't sit right with me, or I think anyone in good conscience. Can you talk about, the effect that this would have, like, tangibly, and how many people would lose dreams that they've worked years and years and years to have, and it almost makes it worse because the dream came true and then it's ripped away. Like, it's like you made it and then you didn't.
Yeah, well, that's 100% right. There's so many people that are being affected by this, and when it comes to people are always like, oh, well, if football was just out of this, but it's affecting football too. A lot of football programs now have quite a few walk-on players, and some are probably having 120, 130 athletes on the team, and now they're going down to 105 for their roster limit. So there's still rosters that are being cut at the football level too. And I think when it comes to student athletes that are being affected, for me, it's just like I look at the girls that are on the team that I coach and the group that I work with, and I know each of their stories. I know them as individuals. And the day we found this out, we kind of had a bonfire at our coach's house and kind of broke the news to the girls and just had a time to reflect. And there was a lot of tears, not only from them, but from us as coaches too. And the work that you put in to work with all these student athletes makes a huge impact on everyone's life. And for that to kind of all be taken away, like you said, yeah, each number is a person. And then that's not even including some of the high school seniors who normally would be a great pickup for us, but now we can't even guarantee a roster limit or a roster spot for them too.
Yeah, going back to the dream piece, I think walk-ons are such a critical part of our sport. And I just did a quick search here. Didn't tailor to running because I think less would have come up. But even when you talk about some of the greatest walk-on athletes in NCAA history, that came up was Stetson Bennett, or recent quarterback at Georgia, won multiple national titles. Baker Mayfield went on to win the Heisman at Oklahoma, now a high level NFL quarterback. Scottie Pippen, for all the Last Dance fans, one of the greatest NBA players of all time. Again, that's like limiting it to basketball and football. I'm sure that list goes on, and I'm sure there are numerous runners who had that walk-on story. But also, it's less about becoming the Baker Mayfield. I think a lot of walk-on athletes realize that their collegiate years are really their professional years, and that's what they're working towards. They probably know they're not going to go to the Olympics, but they're just grateful to go to the NCAA. How does this, tangibly affect high schoolers out there who now it's kind of like make or break, in the margin for making it is so infinitely small that I honestly think it will stop a lot of people from getting into the sport?
Yeah, I mean, I just had a conversation with one of our recruits last night about this exact thing, and she was a girl who any other year would be kind of on that bubble of getting some scholarship, but would be like a top level recruit for our women's team. And she's run mid 17s in the 5K. She's run quick times in track. But at this point, like, some of our girls that are on the chopping block potentially have also run those times. And so for us to offer her a roster spot would not be fair to the girls that we already have on our team. And so the best we can say to her is like, hey, we'd love for you to come and try out for our team. And maybe, I mean, Liberty has a running club or something like that they could be a part of and invest in as well. But that's just hard because we were recruiting this girl from this, I mean, over the past year and a half. And now she's thought, hey, this is the place I want to go. And now I might not even have a spot there. So it definitely affects high school seniors. And if this continues going, like it affects each person more and more, because it's like we're looking at a lot of the freshmen on our team and saying, man, it really hurts for them even more than some of our juniors or seniors. But yeah, I mean, the seniors in high school are really probably having a hard time figuring out, and they're having to grow up a little quicker, figuring out this tough life decision.
This is something I talked about with Stone. If these conferences institute these limits, but other, places like Liberty don't have to, or D2, D3 schools specifically, how do you think this will affect the nature and structure of the NCAA as a whole, and like where talent ends up falling?
Yeah, I think that's probably to be determined still. I do think I mean, talent in the NCAA is continuing to grow each year. The times, I mean, part of this is the super shoes, but the times that it took to qualify for even Division III, I won nationals 7-8 years ago. I might not have even made it to the national meet now. And like same thing for Division II, it continues to grow. I do think some of those, maybe it will even out the playing field a little more in Division I for some of those schools who have more roster limits or maybe even choose to not opt in. But I think the jury's still out to see what opportunities and what that's all going to lead to. And I think, again, this all opens up a whole can of worms of discussions and topics. And at the end of them, a lot of those you just kind of have to say, I don't know. I guess we'll just have to wait and find out.
Did a quick little search, and someone might have to fact check me here, but I did my best to fact check myself in real time. Some walk-ons that came within the NCAA, Meb Keflevsky, which I'm sure most people know who that is, but if you don't, NCAA champion in the 10K in 2000 and 2004 Olympic silver medalist in the marathon. He then went on to win the Boston Marathon, if I'm not mistaken. Craig Virgin, Illinois legend. He was a two-time world cross-country champion, NCAA champion in cross-country in 1973. And then I didn't realize this, and you might have to correct me on the last name here, but Josh McDougall from Liberty University, look at that. He was at NCAA cross country champion 2005, great year I was born, and two-time NCAA track All-American. And it says, at least here, McDougall has spoken about his humble beginnings at Liberty, where he earned a scholarship after his initial walk-on status. All those people, like, I mean, even let's take Meb, for instance, Olympic medalist, Boston Marathon champion. I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but if he knew that he couldn't immediately make it on UCLA's roster, would he have trained as hard? I don't know. It's like it raises the question of how many Olympians, that would be, if things stayed the way they are, won't ever be and won't ever pan out because of these decisions. And I guess that leads to the question that you also kind of wrote on of how it will affect U.S. Olympic success, as well as the coaching infrastructure, with many Olympic coaches coming from NCAA programs. Can you speak to that aspect?
Yeah, well, I'll give a shout out to Coach Heather Zealand. She was also, and her daughter Allie Zealand. I think you've had her on the podcast before too. Coach Heather was a walk-on athlete at Liberty, almost didn't run in college, and then became Liberty's first ever NCAA champion in the mile indoor. And she beat, I think, names like Shalane Flanagan was in that race too. And so 100%, like if she would have not even had a spot on the team, she probably wouldn't have ran in college. And I think and then she went on to run professionally and run at some Olympic trials, and she wouldn't have been one of those names. And that's someone that is obviously that I know would be in that situation. But I mean, that's the big question is, like, right now, the NCAA is a developmental ground for the Olympics, right? Like, I mean, it's just insane to me how like Graham Blanks, Parker Wolf, like some of those guys that went on to place top three or go to the Olympics for Parker Valby, right? Like all these athletes are training in the NCAA at this level. And who knows, with some of the amazing coaches that are in the NCAA right now, there's going to be missed opportunities for Olympians, for medalists, because of the roster limitations that are happening.
Talking specifically on how it affects your program, which I know you've talked extensively to in this conversation, but putting some numbers to it. So women's track and cross country, current roster is 32 for cross country, 70 for track and field. With next year's limits, it would put it from 32 to 17 and then 70 to 45. My question for you as a coach, I know you care so deeply about the individual and the person and not just the athlete and what they do for you from a times perspective or accolades perspective. What's the conversation like with the girls on the team who are 18th to 32nd? They I'm sure inevitably know that they're on the chopping block, and I'm sure you've experienced this, maybe not, correct me if I'm wrong, as well as other programs throughout the NCAA. This kind of naturally creates probably a very unhealthy mindset for these girls. Specifically, like if you're 18 to 20th, you probably have some contention with 15th through 13th, where it's so cutthroat now. It's like you either make it or you don't. And I imagine that's not healthy from a that's not healthy competition right there. And I don't think it's good for the NCAA to kind of institute that. I think it's a side effect here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, those numbers are rough, obviously, for us here at Liberty. And I think I'll first speak to the current team culture that we have on our women's team, is incredible. Like these girls love each other so much, and whether it's the 32nd girl or the first girl, um, they're all treated the same. They all care about each other. They all have their roles, and that's something we talk about a lot. Is if my squad can help push the A squad, that's going to make the whole team better. And this year, it was very evident. But I think like yeah, every girl has their own personality, has their own ambitions, has their own story. And yeah, it's obviously after we had that, I had an individual meeting with each of them, and one of the girls, she was kind of funny. She's like, "I'm gonna be so real with myself. I'm getting cut next year." uh, so I gotta, and I was like, well, let's figure it out. Like, what can we do? And she actually ended up getting on the transfer portal and transferring to another school. And like, definitely wish her the best in her endeavors. There's some other girls on our team that, hey, they're like, yeah, I think I can make the team. Some other girls that are like, hey, running's been fun at the college level, but maybe I'm just going to join the running club, or maybe I'm going to hang up the spikes and just focus on my major and being a regular college student. So it definitely, I wouldn't say there's created a lot of tension on our team specifically, but I definitely think that that's something that it's just hard because you got some of our top runners are best friends with some of our maybe not top 17, and that's where it doesn't only affect the people that are getting cut. It affects the whole team and the whole culture and the whole program.
I could see some people saying, "Oh, 17, that's more than enough. Seven is varsity. You travel squad, maybe 8, 9, 10." But to Stone's conversation, let's talk about SEC Power 5 schools. If they initiate the 10, I laugh because it's laughable. The 10-person roster limits.
Yeah.
How are these programs going to function, right? I mean, it's a coach's miracle that all 10 athletes stay healthy at once. You do, yeah, and just even from like a Stone talk to this, people have different talents. You pair up people differently in training. Like people
Hmm.
transfer. You have people, it takes a year to adjust, and also with that adjustment, like the beauty of the walk-on status, might you call it, like you have some time to develop and mature into an athlete. This is going to put probably some terrible pressure on a freshman coming out of high school to immediately perform. Otherwise, either they're not going to make the top 10, or a coach in the back of their mind is going to be like, um, let's just bring in another kid who will replace you and actually perform right away. And I imagine too, going on a rant here, that it's not going to help international transfers either. If we know that we can now recruit 59-minute half marathoners from East Africa, well, let's just bring
Yeah.
them in over developing a freshman, because obviously they're
Hmm.
going to perform better off the bat.
Yeah. I mean, definitely each school is going to have their nuances of playing this game of not only abiding by the NCAA new roster limits, but also trying to balance that with the Title IX numbers that they're already having to juggle. And so that's where each school is going to be a little different. Um, but yeah, I mean, as far as like, yeah, the SEC schools having 10 on the roster, the discussion now is like, hey, is coaching more about developing athletes, or just keeping them healthy? And if we can keep them healthy, uh, and maybe that changes kind of how certain programs train their athletes, how and I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. Um, for certain programs that might like say, hey, here's our cookie cutter model. Um, we run 150-mile weeks, and if you survive, you're going to make our top 7. But if you don't, like, there's definitely going to be some changes in how a program like that might operate.
Very practically, if this goes through, is this the death of the NCAA as we know it?
Um, I wouldn't say the death. I would say um, it if the NCAA didn't settle and kept fighting for it, from what I understand, that it would have gone to 5 billion, then 10 billion, and all of a sudden the NCAA is no more. And so for them, settling was almost like a last ditch effort. Um, Do I think it's going to be the biggest overhaul for collegiate athletics at the Division I level of all time? Absolutely. I think our athletic director I was in a facilities meeting, and he came and talked to our facilities crew and said, kind of used the analogy of, I forget, it's a book, and they talked about how when they were first discovering America, they were planning on canoeing through the entire and navigating this system of getting across the United States. And then all of a sudden they showed up at the Rocky Mountains, and all these people that were leading them through discovering America were on canoes, and they're like, oh, we haven't seen those before. And now they're having to navigate a mountain range, but all they know how to do is navigate streams and rivers and creeks. And so I think that's kind of the analogy that our athletic director used of the change that's happening in our sport. And I definitely think that's kind of the era we're going to be in. Is the NCAA might not die, but it's going to be changed as we know it, and pretty drastically.
I've been pretty pessimistic this whole time. What's the optimistic view? Give the people some, they close out of this episode finishing up their run. What's the positive perspective that we can take away from any of this, or just ways in which you're viewing this in an optimistic light?
Yeah. So I think right now, a lot of people at first, when they're hearing about these roster limits and things like that, are getting pretty emotional, and like their life is going everywhere. And honestly, for us here at Liberty, and I'm sure other coaches, it's an opportunity to speak truth into these athletes' lives. And I've just been so impressed with the girls on our team that they're coming to me and saying like, hey, Coach Mark, like, we know this is hurting you too. But we trust the Lord that he has a plan. And obviously being at a Christian school like Liberty, that's a huge part of our program. And these girls are putting their faith into action and showing that like, hey, even though the walls around me seem to be crumbling and the carpet is getting pulled out from under me, I trust that God has a plan for my life, and I'm going to follow that. And so I think ultimately it's helping people grow. It's helping people learn. I believe that God's on the throne in heaven, and he knows what's going to happen through this situation. And ultimately, I think there is changes that still can be had. And so without getting into the whole story, I went to the coaching convention down in Orlando, Florida, with a bunch of collegiate coaches, and they did the Bowerman down there, and some different things. And it was funny. I was just in the hot tub with one of my buddies, and sitting next to us was Maya Ramsden, and she was there for the Bowerman, and came up the elevator, and Parker Valby was there too. And so anyway, just like a great environment. But a lawyer came, and he spoke at one of the symposiums about this topic. And I met with him actually after for about 20 minutes, and he connected me with a group of lawyers that's actually working to actively oppose this settlement, and not just the settlement as a whole, but specifically the roster limits portion. And so I met with this group of lawyers, which they told me I couldn't give their specific information or say who they are, but I don't know if on the show notes I can leave my email or phone number, and if people want to reach out to me, then I can connect them with these people. And basically what they're doing is getting as many coaches, athletes that are currently in the NCAA, high school seniors, and they're having phone calls with them and saying like, hey, how is this affecting you? How is this affecting your program? And then they're going to they're going to write a declaration for you, and they're going to, they'll send it to you. You can edit it, then you sign it, and then they're going to go to the judge on April 7th at the hearing, and they're going to give a pointed argument to the judge and say, hey, Judge Wilkin, like, if you give a thumbs up to this settlement, please take out the roster limit. Please adjust it. Please do something, because we've talked to 700 athletes, 50 coaches, 100 high school seniors that we have their stories, we have their statements, and it's affecting them in a negative way. And so to me, there's still hope. There's still a fight to be had. And I've already had conversations with our entire team. We're hosting a meet this past weekend, and an athlete from Virginia Tech that's going to be cut. I had a conversation with him. He texted me. I sent him the emails. He's going to reach out. I talked to a high school senior last night, gave her the information. And so I kind of get like, I don't know, like maybe hopefully not like a cult leader, but kind of this excitement of like, we can make a change and our voices can be heard. And these lawyers are trying to get a pointed argument to make a change in this settlement. And so that's the hope that I would love to leave the audience with, and would love to connect with anyone on that topic too, if they're interested in learning more.
Yeah, I'll leave first line of this podcast show notes. I'll leave your email for those who are applicable in that situation to reach out to you, because it'd be great to get some momentum from this podcast there. Question as we wrap up here: how much effect in a positive way would come from I just don't know how the United States government operates, quite frankly. I need to go back to my U.S. history days. Like a congressman involved, or even I'm thinking about TikTok right now, how President-elect Trump has talked about bringing back TikTok, which hot take, we don't need TikTok. As someone who's on TikTok, who would ban it, that and Snapchat, we don't need them. But anyways, yeah, like talking about how he can bring it back despite, the whole process of it being in the federal courts, X, Y, and Z. Not going to speak on that because I don't really know the intricacies, but say a president-elect Trump or some big-time congressman got involved here, what effect could they have? Because one thing I've discovered over the podcast over the years is you never know who's listening. So who knows?
Well, I mean, that's the first thing I asked our associate athletic director the first meeting. I was like, what can we do to change this? And he's like, it's going to have to change at the Congress level. And so that day I drafted an email to Congress, and I wrote I have it right here, and basically sent that to our athletic director, the different coaches, some different people to edit it. And then I edited it, and there's actually an athlete on our team who his dad is a congressman. And I gave him that information, and I coach a few online athletes, and one of them has some crazy connections with different people high up in politics. And so he helped me edit it and make it sound better. And so I'm giving that to everyone I can. And like you said, you never know whose desk it's going to end up on and what difference it can make. But I do think that, I mean, things might be hard to make a change at that level, just with, I mean, maybe all the different issues that are going on in our world that they're trying to make changes on. But the number of people that are getting affected by this and contributing citizens are quite large, as we talked about. And so I think congressmen are aware of this situation. It's just if enough of them can band together and try to make a change. So that's what I'm hoping for, and super excited to kind of be in this process. And it's been a crazy ride so far, and looking forward to seeing what happens over the next couple months.
Final question for you. For those listening who are affected by this news, call it a high school junior or senior who has dreams of running in a Power 5 school within the NCAA, or someone who's maybe, first man out on a team if this goes into effect, what's the final takeaway message that you would have for someone in that position?
My advice to them is find your identity, and figure out who you want to be, what you want to do. And for us at Liberty and a lot of our athletes, they're finding their identity in Christ. And that's a huge part of who they are. And that allows them to stand firm when everything around them is crumbling. And so for high school seniors and juniors, like, find something that can't be taken away from you, no matter what happens outside of your control.
On a much, much, much lighter note, Coach Mark, the question I ask every guest to close out every single episode: if you had Gordon Ramsay coming over to your house for dinner, what would you choose to make for him? Quite frankly, not appropriate to end on that question with this conversation, but you gotta end on something light and fun. So we'll include the textbook question.
I love it, and I knew it was coming, so I kind of was prepared. Each summer, we kind of go back and hang out with my wife's family in Michigan, and we take turns cooking for their entire family. She has five siblings, and so it's big family. And uh, we made this recipe called "Marry Me Chicken Tortellini," and that was a huge hit this summer. So. We made it three or four times, and I'd probably have to go with the "Marry Me Chicken Tortellini."
Coach Mark, thank you so much for this conversation, enlightening me and our audience, as well as all the work you're doing behind the scenes. The least I can do is shed some light on your dedication to the sport and trying to save the sport, quite frankly. So prayers that action can come out of this conversation, and prayers for, all those in power to make decisions that are in the best interest of growing our sport and keeping it alive. So keep up the great work. And yeah, truly from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all that you're doing for our sport.
Yeah, and thank you, Dominic, too. Like I know you are doing so much for our sport, and if like people have said, and maybe he said before, like give this guy a 5-star review and give him some love because I love what you're doing. It's so fun listening to all the incredible guests you brought in. I feel humbled to have been a part of being on your podcast at least once. So thank you.